Hello everybody and welcome to Sin City Living. My name is Jason.
Amy.
And we are bringing you today's episode of History from Vegas, or Vegas history. And as we promised before, we're going to continue with the mob theme for a little while. So this is actually a fan request. We had a fan that emailed us asking us if we could do this particular person. And we're going to cover a lot on this person. Very, very small amount of it is actually related to Vegas, but since he was such a pivotal figure as far as Vegas and the mob goes, we figure we're still within our theme of Vegas. And as always, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. We have a ton of content coming out every single week, every single day. You don't want to miss a thing. And especially these two shows we're doing Tuesday and Thursday nights at 7 o'clock. Always a good time. Our usual shout out of appreciation to our patrons. All those tips and support are only going to go towards making the channel better. We're hoping to be able to add so many things to this channel as soon as we're able to. And I hope you guys are enjoying those patron-only exclusive videos that we're putting out. We're actually thinking about putting out a couple every so often that are more like this, where we'll pick a subject and discuss it, a crime or something along those lines. So if you guys are curious about it, go ahead and check the description of the video down below for more information. And if anybody has anything they would like to see us film, or any questions, strategies, anything related to casinos, Vegas, gambling, the various games that we cover, just shoot us an email at sincitylivingLV@gmail.com and we'd be happy to do it for you. Otherwise, we're going to jump right into today's video. So for today's video, we are covering Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky is, or was, rather, he's not around anymore.
No.
Died in the mid-'80s. He was a legendary crime boss. There's some debate about it, but for the most part, it's pretty rock solid. He was an absolutely legendary mob boss. He was born, I want to say, 1903, because I believe he died in 1983. Okay, so he was born in 1902, and he was Jewish, and ran the Jewish mob. Now, what was interesting with Meyer Lansky is that he was friends with a number of major figures within the Italian mob as well, and he was pretty much best friends with Lucky Luciano, who was a major figure in the Italian mob. The two of them basically are what organized and structured the mobs. Luciano had most of the influence in structuring the Italian mobs, creating the commission, putting the rank and hierarchy in there, and actually was the boss of bosses for quite some time.
Super smart dudes.
And Meyer Lansky was the same thing with the Jewish mob. He when he took over the Jewish mob, he created these hierarchies. He put all this into play, and because his number two was Bugsy Siegel. And they remained super close friends all the way up until Siegel's death, that we'll talk about a little bit later. But Luciano and Lansky were incredibly tight. They were so tight that they unofficially merged their organizations, the Italian mob and the Jewish mob, for quite a long time during the early part of the 20th century. Early part of the 20th century. They were, for all intents and purposes, almost one mob. The Italian mob would use Jewish mobsters as hitmen and other strong arm type workers, and it was very common back then for Jewish mob members to be working with Italian mob members and even taking orders from Italian mob members, and Italian mob members could be doing a job with the Jewish mob and taking orders from a Jewish mob member. And it was even to the point where, even though the Jewish mob was, of course, separate from the Italian mob, and the Italians looked at themselves as superior, Lansky was so tight with Luciano, and so tight and so well respected with the mob, that he actually had a seat, an unofficial seat on the commission. He was invited in, and he was basically a board member for a global criminal empire. I mean, back then especially, the mobs were global. Nowadays, what remains of the mobs are much smaller. They're not quite so global because of the rise of, one, law enforcement, two, the globalization of law enforcement.
RICO Act.
And three, the rise of all these other criminal elements around the world that it's very difficult for a criminal element stationed in one spot of the world to have a strong grip on another part of the world. Doesn't mean that these organizations don't have tendrils everywhere, but the mob controlled, I mean, they controlled basically Italy.
They still do?
And up to a point. They controlled Cuba. They controlled most of the U.S.'s underworld. They were in South America. They were in Central America.
The Bahamas.
They were Bahamas. They were all over the place. And Lansky played a massive, massive, massive part of that. And plus, he actually helped the Italian mafia gain as much strength as they did by helping them organize it and working with them and working with Lucky Luciano. What was Lucky's real name? Charles?
No.
We'll get back to you on that one. I know it's going to come to us, or
Salvatore?
it's going to be in my notes further on.
Pretty sure it was Salvatore Luciano.
So, yeah, we will be diving into Meyer Lansky. Alrighty, so, Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was born, as we said, in 1902.
Wow, he was born?
He was. He was born in 1902 in, technically, Russia. But if you ask him, well, you'd get no answer because he's a skeleton, but had you asked him back then, he would have said he was born in Poland, because he was born in
the USSR?
The former lands of Crown of the Kingdom of Poland. Basically, he was born in Poland.
But it's now Belarus.
Right, he was born in basically in Poland, but at the time it was controlled by Russia. And that area that he was born in, the town he was born in, is now Belarus. At a very young age, I think he was 9, they immigrated to the United States. Now, his parents were Jewish, so Lansky, of course, was Jewish as well. Now, he was a little man. He was basically a runt.
Hey.
And he was 5'4" tall.
5'4" is a perfectly adequate height. I myself am 5'4".
So, like I was saying, he was basically a midget, and but he was tough. He was very, very tough. He could definitely defend himself. Obviously, he rose up through the criminal underworld and basically became a kingpin. Not only he didn't have Daredevil coming after him. And when he was a teenager, he met Bugsy Siegel, and they became lifelong friends, or at least
all of Bugsy's life.
Bugsy Siegel's life. In fact, Siegel saved his life a few times, something that Lansky never forgot, always appreciated. From all accounts, Lansky was an extraordinarily loyal person, which is part of why he was so well respected even amongst the Italian mob, because his loyalty just extended to those who were loyal to him and were friendly with him. So he was just as loyal to the Italian mob as he was to his friends or anybody else.
And in let's see, back in the early 19 teens, him and Bugsy Siegel ran the Bugs and Meyer mob, which ended up becoming their branch of the Jewish mob.
Before they ended up just taking over the entire Jewish mob.
Yeah.
And they also, as they became lifelong friends, they started out with their small little subset of the mob, and they were bootleggers, which was big money back then.
Oh, yeah.
The bootlegging industry back then was basically like the cocaine industry now, only it wasn't looked
80s.
down upon quite so much, because even the people that were theoretically enforcing the bootlegging laws
thought it was bullshit,
and were drinking at home and such like that, because technically it was still legal to drink at home. And they ended up meeting and befriending Lucky Luciano. And Luciano eventually rose to great power within the Italian mafia. Now, it started out really because of Meyer Lansky. Meyer Lansky was instrumental in organizing the assassination of Salvatore Maranzano.
Yep.
Maranzano, which in 1931, which opened the way for Luciano to rise to the power that he did. And at that point, right shortly thereafter, is when they started to enter the gambling industry. Now, Meyer's entrance into the gambling industry, or rather his eventual control of the gambling industry, was massive. He controlled gambling institutions from Miami to Vegas to Cuba, Florida, New Orleans, I always said Miami, all over the place.
The
And they were
Bahamas.
all extraordinarily successful. And they were successful for two reasons, one of which is still valid today as the reason that gambling is so as successful as it is. The first reason they were so successful is they used their money and they used it wisely. They did a lot of bribes. They made sure their operations were very, very secure. And they had a lot of technical expertise. Lansky and his Jewish mob were basically experts in the odds of all the gambling games, the mathematics of them. They understood all the numbers behind the most popular at the time games.
Not to mention that Meyer Lansky was known in his youth as being extraordinarily gifted when it came to mathematics. Every account I've read of him in his childhood, he dropped out after completing the 8th grade, but people who knew him back then, he was pretty much a literal genius.
In fact, when we say that there's some dispute over exactly how powerful he was within the mob, there are some people that will say that he wasn't so much controlling the mob and a mobster as he was the mob's accountant. But there's just so much evidence showing that he was far, far, far more than that. But the crucial thing that made them so successful was using their expertise and using their money to ensure the safety and security via bribes or just employing the right people. They made sure they had all their licenses and things along those lines taken care of. But the number one thing, even back then, Lansky absolutely refused to allow his places to be clip joints. Every single one of the gambling establishments that Meyer Lansky controlled ran off the house edge and the house edge only. His gambling operations were known to be as honest as it can possibly get. They were as honest as any gambling institution you're going to find in Vegas nowadays. There was nothing, there was no cheating, there were no rigged wheels, there were no card sharp dealers, there were no edge sorting, there were no marked cards, there were no rigged dice. Everything was perfectly controlled and above board. And he made it very, very, very clear that his staff always had to be honest and of high integrity. That is something that he was known for back then, was that his management, his employees, even the croupiers, the dealers, everybody was of very, very, very high integrity. And that helped him grow this massive gambling empire that Meyer eventually ended up building. Now, in 1936, his partner, Luciano, went to jail, which is kind of a common theme with most mobsters. They either go to jail or they go underground.
Literally.
And by underground, I mean underground.
6 feet.
Yeah, they're pushing daisies. They're a daisy if they do. And
Oh, I never understood that. That's what that was
daisy if
referring
you
to.
do. Yeah, they're a daisy if you do.
Oh,
So,
huh.
yeah, pushing daisies.
I never made that connection. I just thought that,
It was just another one of his sayings. I'm
Yeah,
Huckleberry.
yeah.
You're a daisy if you do.
yeah. Wow, I like that. Okay, anyways, sorry.
So, Meyer Lansky actually convinced the mafia to put Bugsy Siegel in charge of Las Vegas, and then he became a major investor in Bugsy Siegel's Flamingo Hotel, which is something that we're going to get into in a little bit, not quite immediately, but it was both a good and a bad thing for Bugsy Siegel.
That was not a good thing.
Well, this is in 1936, so for a while it was a good thing.
Yeah.
For about 30 seconds, it was a bad thing.
Well,
Now, after
it was more,
Probably a couple
a lot
months,
of poor choices.
After Al Capone's 1931 conviction for tax evasion and prostitution, Lansky realized how vulnerable he might have been to this as well. Because again, Lansky was brilliant, and he was brilliant with the numbers. He was brilliant with the money. He was just all around just brilliant, and so he was this tough, brilliant midget. I mean, he was just.
Will you quit
He was
with the midget
so-
jokes?
jokes.
You're not much taller.
Taller is taller. So
He's not that tall, guys.
I
mean, look.
I'm taller than 5'4". We're sitting down.
So what?
I'm hunched over.
Sure
I am
you are.
much taller than you.
You are.
So
He's not.
So what Meyer Lansky, I much taller. So what Meyer Lansky ended up doing was what a lot of criminals ended up doing, especially in the 80s. So this you can almost say he started this trend even back then.
Tracksuits and baby oil?
Swiss bank account.
Yeah, that's in
Swiss
part
bank
of my
account.
notes.
He opened a Swiss bank account and started funneling as much of his money as he could there, because the numbered Swiss bank accounts, their anonymity was ensured by the 1934 Swiss Banking Act. So the Swiss actually passed a law to make sure that the anonymity of their numbered bank accounts was secure.
Ironclad.
But it got even better. Lansky eventually bought an offshore bank. Just straight up bought a bank so that he could launder his money through it.
Not only his money.
Shell and hold it. Oh yeah, the whole mob.
Yep.
The whole mob, Jewish mob, Italian mob. There is, yes, he could also be considered the mob's accountant, but he was so much more than that.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, I mean, just,
Fingers and all the pies.
our money's going to be much safer there, so I'm just going to buy it. It's like Iron Man.
I mean,
how fast can we buy this building that we're about to destroy?
Yeah. Done.
Now, at one point, the mob, the Jewish mob, and the Italian mob actually stepped away from crime. So, the mob in the 30s, they can't really say they stepped away from criminal work. That might have been mislabeling things. They expanded. They grew.
They decided to use their evil for good for a change.
Slapped a cape on the backside of their mask. It's no better than the last time I tried to say it.
No.
So what they did, and there's two parts to this, but the first part is the unofficial part. So the unofficial part is Lansky and his, I was going to call them cronies, but they were a pretty professional mob. So his underlings, his associates, his pals, his peeps, they were breaking up Nazi rallies and Nazi propaganda. And even though they were outnumbered sometimes, they would go to these things, a dozen of them or just over a dozen of them, and they would rush in and they would throw people out of the windows and rip stuff down, and then when everyone ran away...
Pretty much the Jewish Avengers.
Who was
Revengers?
Thor. Sun's getting mighty low there. So apparently there was a rally in New York, in Manhattan, that something like this happened, that they broke apart. And these tough guy Nazis would go running away, and they'd catch them and hand them a solid beatdown. So that's the unofficial. Now the official gets even crazier, because in the 40s, right, or World War II, in World War II, the United States government and the ONI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, they actually went to the mob and asked for their help in securing the ports.
They controlled them.
And, there's probably a little bit of asking for their help in securing the ports and asking for their help so that they wouldn't be messing with our stuff. I mean, it's probably a little bit of both, to be honest. But the mob agreed. The Jewish mob, the Italian mob, they agreed. And it was to the point where, at one point, Luciano put the word out through the U.S., through Canada, through Italy, through Sicily, and called for mafia soldiers, hitmen, hit squads to go to the United States and secure and guard the ports. So apparently from some accounts, hundreds of thousands of mafia thugs
That's scary.
showed up in the United States and were guarding the United States ports. And they were guarding them against infiltration, against sabotage, and just securing the United States government and naval interests around these ports. Now, we can't say this was entirely altruistic, because the United States government basically bribed the mobs. What they gave them quite possibly could have been what really helped the mob afterwards grow as powerful as it did. Because while YouTube has some restrictions on what we can say on on these videos in regards to certain items. I'm not going to list everything out. So we'll just say that the United States government gave the mafia weapons and material of war. They gave them things that I didn't even carry when I was in the Army. The things that I learned how to shoot and did get to shoot once as a gunner.
The fun stuff.
But the kind of stuff that, yeah, it's fun. It's a lot of fun, actually. But
Stuff
the kind
they
of
wouldn't
stuff,
be able to go into the gun store and buy.
the kind of stuff they probably couldn't even get on the black market. I mean, I'm talking the mob was outfitted in such a way that they could have taken out tanks. They were given basically every bit of war material you can imagine that is figure it was either man portable, and think of every single thing that a soldier not was issued with, but could carry and use. Anything that was man portable, the mob was given, including things like bulletproof vests even. And they were given materials that wouldn't have even been man portable, would have at least been vehicle portable. So think of some of those larger weapons that you couldn't carry, but a couple guys could load onto a Jeep, and then 3 or 4 guys could shoot this stuff off. That's the kind of stuff that the mob was given by the United States as basically as payment for securing the ports. And it wasn't just Lansky. You're talking Lansky, Luciano, Frank Costello, Albert Anastasia.
Anybody who was anybody in the mob.
All the big, basically the ones that
Called the shots.
told the ones who were somebody what to do. I mean, these guys were it was Luciano, I believe. It was Luciano that put the word out to have this big gathering. It's like Highlander. They had a big gathering of mob members in the United States securing things. However, like we said, it wasn't entirely altruistic, because Luciano also had some reasons why he may have wanted to do this.
Yeah, he was locked up, and in exchange for his help and influence among all of his other associates, he was granted freedom. But in exchange, he had to get the hell out of the United States and stay the hell out of the United States.
Which I'm sure he was more than willing to do, and certainly never planned on going back on that agreement. In fact, from what I vaguely remember, I could be wrong about this, but I believe that it wasn't just that he was supposed to leave the United States and not return. I believe it was he was supposed to go to Italy and never leave Italy again.
Yep.
That's correct. So
yeah.
It wasn't just that he was deported; he was kicked out of the U.S. He was basically kicked out of the world and kicked to Italy. Is pretty much
Get out and stay there.
Pretty much the gist of it. He wasn't supposed to leave Italy. That didn't last very long.
No.
But that is something we will probably cover in a Luciano episode.
Yes.
Because he's got just enough of a tangential tie to Las Vegas that I think we could pull off an episode on that. Speaking of Las Vegas, now we're going to get into the fun stuff. So in the 40s, Meyer Lansky and his associate Bugsy Siegel, well, actually it was mostly Siegel at the time, Bugsy Siegel went to the mob bosses, went to a number of the ones that control the money. It wasn't necessarily their money.
But it was likely on Lansky's influence and reputation that he got the audience and the power that he ended up with.
Or at least got the ear. They probably wouldn't have listened to him.
No.
Yes, absolutely. Because he was, Siegel was a known factor within the mob. He was Lansky's number 2.
But he wasn't as respected as Lansky.
Right.
He wasn't as held in as high of esteem as Lansky was. And I'm sure that his friendship and the fact that Lansky vouched for him, that he got what he got.
And they probably trusted Lansky more, because typically, if you go back through and look at a lot of mob history, the number 2s often are a pale shadow of the number 1s.
Yeah.
But they often have a different skill set too. Usually the leaders, while they may be brutal and tough, they're usually extremely smart and cunning and conniving, while the number 2s are usually the hammer. They're usually more the hammer. I mean, Siegel was a smart guy. He was not your mafia thug that you might think of from various movies that you may have seen. He definitely was an upper echelon leader type for sure, but he was no Lansky.
No.
He didn't have Lansky's intelligence. He didn't have Lansky's abilities. He didn't have Lansky's charisma. You couldn't have done what Lansky did without charisma.
Yeah.
I mean, if nothing else, the ties to the Italian mob are almost impossible to pull off for
a non-Italian
and a Jewish mobster.
Because they were pretty heated rivals at one point.
So Siegel goes and tries to get these investors because he's got an idea for a new location. Can't say new business because it's something they'd all been involved in for a fairly long time at this point, especially Lansky. And Lansky was famous for this. This is how he built his empire, basically, or the financial side of his empire. But Siegel wanted to build a lavish, big, beautiful, modern resort in what was basically the new, at the time, hub of gambling and vice, Las Vegas.
Las Vegas wasn't even a large thing yet.
Not yet, but it was starting to get there. They had just started passing the laws about legalizing gambling. They had just changed the laws, shortening the amount of time required within the state for things like marriages and divorces. And some of this stuff came up when I was doing the research for last week's episode. And right around this time, Las Vegas was starting to become known as a place for, oddly enough, gambling, drinking, marriages, and divorce, which is kind of weird how all four of those seem to have gone together. Drinking probably led to a lot of marriages. Gambling could have led to a lot of divorces. Quite possibly.
You might be onto something. Not much has changed.
No, yeah, to this day, not much has changed. So Siegel goes to all these mob bosses with this idea for this, basically, at the time, it would have been considered kind of a mega resort. Nowadays, it would be considered like a strip mall casino, almost, in comparison to what we have as mega resorts now. But its name was
The Flamenco,
which was around for a long time. Well,
still is around.
It is. The original is no longer around.
No.
It was leveled in 2004, I want to say, 3 or 4. But I wonder if they kept any original pieces, though. Something.
They've got his apartment.
They kept his.
Yeah.
Okay. So they would have kept something at least.
All of the decor and everything is from his apartment. That was in the penthouse suite.
Okay. So there's still a little bit of those days around, but the rest of it is gone. But the Flamingo itself, definitely still here. And be it Siegel's business pitch or possibly his connection to Lansky, but the investors went for it. They said, well, sure, I mean, you guys are already making money hand over fist with casinos and gambling. We're doing this around the world. Absolutely. How can this possibly miss, especially with Bugsy Siegel, who's been running all these other gambling operations for Lansky? There's just no way it could miss. And it missed. So it didn't go very well. Yeah, didn't go very well. It was losing money. Yeah, you make money hand over fist. This was losing money hand under fist. This was
52,000 pickup.
It was like a monkey trying to screw a football. It just was not going good. So it was just losing money left and right. So the investors called a meeting, a secret meeting in Havana, so secret that we know about it. And they
best kept secrets are.
Oh yeah,
Not
those
secrets.
are no. So they called for Siegel to get whacked, to take a dirt nap, to go bye-bye, to be pushing daisies, because be a daisy if you do.
I never knew that was.
And
If you don't know, now you know.
Now you know. Still, I honestly have no idea what "I'm your Huckleberry" means, though. I'll give you that much.
Probably a reference to Huckleberry Finn.
Could be. So they asked for Siegel to take a long sleep, and Lansky said no. He pushed really hard. I mean, it wasn't his call, but he had a vote in this, of course, and he pushed really hard for them to give Siegel another chance. So they agreed to give Siegel another chance. And
He shit the bed again.
he did. He pooped all over the bed. But when they did their second meeting, they called a second meeting, the Flamingo had turned a profit. It was a small profit, but they had turned a profit. So it was just enough for Lansky to be able to say, look, it's making money now. Let him do what he does. Let's give him another chance, which they agreed. And the bed got dirtier. It started losing money again. So they call a third meeting. Now, at the third meeting, there's some suspicion, there's some guesswork, and some accounts that say that they really pushed Lansky to be the deciding vote, to actually come out and vote for Siegel to go bye-bye. Because of their long relationship and stuff like that, they really pushed for Lansky to be a voice in this, and he probably felt that he had no choice.
I mean, in that world, your reputation is everything. And I'm sure that a lot of it had to do with the fact that he didn't want to end up going the same way as his friend. You know, fighting to save him after so many failed attempts would end up making him look bad as well. And unfortunately, I think that if he would have pushed harder, he probably would have ended up getting whacked too.
Yeah, that's a very good point. There's a good chance that could have happened. I mean, your reputation is everything in that world, and fortunes and lives rise and fall. So the word went out. It was approved, and in 1947, Siegel was whacked in California. And it's fairly obvious that they all knew about it, because less than 20 minutes after his death, Lansky, Gus Greenbaum, and Mo Steadway came walking into the Flamingo and took control. 20 minutes.
Yep.
So they knew, they were staged, they were ready to go. And according to the FBI and their records, Meyer Lansky maintained a financial interest in the Flamingo for the next 2 decades at least. And he never went back on his loyalty to Siegel. He did what he felt needed to be done. But to his dying day, anytime someone bring up Siegel, he would say, if it was up to me, Siegel would still be here. I mean, one thing Lansky was known for was his loyalty. And when this occurred, this actually caused you could almost say a transfer of power, because up to that point, the New York Mafia had been in control of Las Vegas. But when this occurred, the Chicago outfit took over. And Lansky it's believed he maintained his strong ties and was an advisor and an aide to the Chicago boss, Tony Accardo, who established a stronghold in Vegas.
Not only Vegas, but Hollywood as well.
The the Southwest. I mean, Vegas and L.A. were really targets and strongholds of the mob. I mean, you hear about the Chicago mob, the Las Vegas mob, even the Boston Mafia, Boston mob. You don't hear about the Philly mob, Cleveland, but you don't hear about the LA mob.
No.
Even though LA is huge.
Oh yeah.
And that's really because the LA mob was basically the New York mob, the Chicago mob, the Cleveland mob, the Philly mob.
For the better part of the 20th century, especially early 20th century, all of Hollywood was mob run. 100%.
So LA didn't really have its own mob. It was owned by mobs. Now, before we go into the rest of more of Lansky's life after Las Vegas and after this occurred, we do want to point out one thing. You'll notice Siegel was shot in California, and he spent most of his time at the time. I mean, he would have split his time, but he spent a lot of time in Las Vegas running the Flamingo, building it up, all that, and yet they took care of him in California. And why is that? Well, one thing that the mob made sure of is that because all their money, or most of their money, in the Vegas, in the gambling portion, came from tourists, they did not want tourists not to want to come.
They wanted to keep that happy, shiny facade of, hey, this is a great place to vacation. You know, this is where you want to come and spend your time and give us your money. But they didn't want people to associate, you know, oh, this is a place where people go to get killed, or oh, this is not a safe place to take my kids, or oh, this isn't, you know, a place that I feel safe going to.
I mean, it's kind of one of those, hey, honey, let's go to Vegas for New Year's. Well, I'm reading the paper going, they found another body in Las Vegas Boulevard. I mean, it's just not gonna be where people wanted to go back then, while it was still building up. Now Vegas is its own entity. Oh yeah, it definitely has the punchline of the
Holes in the desert.
that were very politely filled up by the mob. The mob would see these holes in the desert and decide that, it's like a pothole. We're going to go ahead and fill it up.
With this asshole that we caught counting cards.
Regardless, still, they filled it up. It was very, very kind of them. Plus, they were helping the environment,
Yeah,
because
fertilization.
It's like mulch.
Yep. Organic.
GMO-free,
Well, back then.
low sugar. Ish. Now, most of Lansky's further life ends up being outside of Vegas. Now, after World War II, Lansky's friend and associate, Lucky Luciano, was paroled from prison on the condition, as we said, that he permanently returned to Sicily. I had Italy in my head, but
Italy and Sicily.
that he permanently returned to Sicily.
Sicily
It
is
was
part of Italy.
but generally, especially by the mob,
It's
considered
its own
separate.
entity.
However, Luciano moved to Cuba secretly, where he continued trying to gain control over American mafia operations. He ran a number of casinos and horse race tracks, nightclubs, bars, and in fact, Lansky actually invented something during that time period. Lansky or Luciano?
It was Lansky. He developed and controlled a RaceWire news service operation that was used to facilitate racetrack info to all the bookies throughout the entirety of the United States. So he revolutionized the way that these bookies could communicate with each other on sporting events.
And there was a fantastic older movie on a con. I think it was called No, it wasn't the con. Anyway, it was a fantastic older movie about conning
Wow, the
on
con was about conning?
on sports and horse racing and stuff like that. I can't remember the name of it now, but it's a classic with I think
From your era?
well before my era.
You sure? That's pretty old.
Yeah, I'm not that old.
Yeah.
So Luciano moves to Cuba, and him and Lansky develop a strong friendship with the then president of Cuba, Batista. And their friendship was a strong, quote-unquote, friendship. They're considered friends. They spend a lot of time together and all that. But really, their friendship was more based on money and mutually beneficial businesses. So basically, Batista passed various laws throughout that time period to make it easier for Lansky, Luciano, and their associates to have more gambling operations. He made it so that the government would match them dollar for dollar over a certain amount of money invested in building up these casinos and nightclubs. He made it so if they were an investor over a certain dollar amount, there was no background check. Just imagine that here in Vegas.
Yeah.
He made it so that if they invested a certain amount of money, they automatically got gambling licenses. And Batista would just get a cut. He just got a cut, a percentage of those businesses, those casinos, those nightclubs. They would agree on mutual agreements for kickbacks to Batista, and not just Batista, but some of the Batista's associates and family as well. There was a conference, a summit held in Havana on
Very, very, very infamous summit.
the Havana Conference is my notes say they capitalize it. The Havana Conference.
Very infamous.
1946 at the Hotel Nacional. This was the first full-scale meeting of most of the underworld kings since the Chicago meeting in 1932.
Which was a cluster.
It's an entire paragraph of famous mafia names. I am going to not read every single one of these names, but Luciano was there as well. He'd been deported to Italy and then had to travel to Havana on a false passport. And Lansky basically gave them his new vision for the new Havana, and how profitable it could be to everybody who's willing to invest. And what he showed them is how easy it would be, because they had the government in their pocket. They had the government helping them, and they could make it all legitimate. And they even, like, the entertainment for this was Frank Sinatra. I mean, these guys were connected.
Well, I mean, Frank was a known mob affiliate.
Yeah, very, very well known for that. And their influence and their ties to Batista, I really should make sure that's his name.
It is.
Okay. To Batista were so strong that in the 50s, Lansky actually bribed the president of Cuba with $6 million, and back then $6 million was a fat chunk of change, to step down so Batista could take control again. And he did. So Batista took control all over again. And was once again the dictator of Cuba, and continued to have these ties with the mob, with their casinos, with their nightclubs. He even unofficially hired Lansky at a salary of $500,000 a year to be an unofficial gambling minister for Cuba. I mean, Lansky was basically the gambling kingpin of the world. Really, all these gambling hubs around the world probably wouldn't exist the way they do nowadays if it wasn't for Meyer Lansky and the mob. But mostly Meyer Lansky, I mean,
and Luciano.
And Luciano's influence and help, really. Mm-hmm. You know, Lansky was the mind. Luciano was the one that gave it legitimacy to the rest of the mob.
But Luciano, in his own right, was a brilliant man.
Oh, yes. Very, very smart. But he wasn't his gambling focus. Lansky really seen gambling like...
Well, I'm sure he saw the potential in it, for it to be just this enormous...
cash cow.
Yeah.
I mean, these cows were just farting money. I mean, it was just
cow
insane.
pies?
Yeah, they were... Yeah. Well, I've seen some money that smells pretty funny.
Well, I mean, according to certain sources, the NFR, the cow and horse shit, just smells like money.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, I can definitely see that. So after this, after they bribed the president to step down so that Batista could step back up, that's when he really started changing the various laws to more favor them and to give them more help. He eliminated the background checks and stuff like that during this time period. Put in taxes exemptions, gave them matching money for construction. At one point, all of Cuba's slot machines were paying a percentage to Cuba and to Batista, including the little kids gaming slots at fairs that were spitting out toys and candy. Cuba had 10,000 slot machines at that time, and even those little ones were the province of actually Batista's brother-in-law. He was the one that was getting the percentage from that. But I mean, Batista was so corrupt that he had an army general that was getting kickbacks, and just to make sure he was getting enough, he even got a cut from the parking meters. I mean, pretty much everything back then was all done to line the pockets of those with the power. Can't say just Batista and his generals and his family, but also Luciano and Lansky and all that. They were making money just hand over fist. And again, not just the casinos. Nightclubs, which nightclubs above a certain dollar amount invested in them got gambling licenses. So they would have slot machines in their nightclubs.
Sounds like Vegas.
And, well,
you can go to the
grocery
grocery stores and gamble.
Considering how gas prices go, you're pretty much always gambling anyway. They should have them at like mechanic shops and hospitals. I mean, you're pretty much gambling when you're
having a Taco Bell too. Always make you gamble with the fart.
At Chipotle Casino, I can see it. So yeah, Batista was just, they were lining everybody's pockets. Just everybody was just getting stupid money from this, from everything. Again, nightclubs, the hotels. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting hotels, but the hotels, the nightclubs, the casinos, everything. I mean, at one point, the slot machines alone contribute $1 million to the regime's bank accounts. $1 million freaking dollars from these slot machines back in the 1950s. That's a lot of money. That is a ton of money getting contributed. But then they ran into a small little snag. So then something happened. What happened? Cuban Revolution. Cuban Revolution
Was
just
bad for everyone.
messed up Lansky and what he had going on. The 1959 Cuban Revolution, that was the rise of Fidel Castro, someone who was still very, very famous even to this day.
A terrible, terrible, terrible person.
Because Batista was such a lovely human being.
But Castro?
Castro, yeah. So, now Batista was able to flee. He managed to flee. And Lansky stayed for a little while. And when the revolution kicked off and Batista fled, most of the casinos, including a bunch of Lansky's, were looted and destroyed in that May night. And in January 8th, 1959, Castro marched in Havana and took it over. He set up shop in the Hilton. Now, Lansky had fled the day before, luckily, made it to the Bahamas or somewhere else in the Caribbean, right? And the new Cuban president took steps to close the casinos. He began closing the casinos. But then in 1960, Castro nationalized all the island's hotel casinos and outlawed gambling. This action basically, because at this point, most of Lansky's efforts and focus was in Cuba. And this basically wiped out his entire asset base and all his revenue streams, just about. The estimation is that he lost somewhere in the realm of $170 million. $170 million. That's a lot of money in today's money.
And that's even more money in 1960s money.
1960s money, I mean, that was just almost unheard of.
That's Scrooge McDuck swimming in piles of gold coins money.
But wait,
There's more.
Right around that same time period, Miami started cracking down on gambling as well, and casinos. So what happened was Lansky was basically forced to depend entirely on his Las Vegas revenue.
Which he had many revenue streams in Las Vegas.
He did. Now, and remember that according to the FBI, Lansky had financial interest in the Flamingo for over 20 years after Siegel's death. So that extended into the late 1960s.
And also the Fremont, the Sands, the Thunderbird Hotel, the Horseshoe, and the Stardust.
That's a lot of casinos. It's a lot of casinos that actually have. There's a lot of stories behind those casinos too that I'm sure we're going to cover in episodes later on in this series for this show. In fact, I actually used to work for the company that eventually took over the Stardust by Nevada Gaming Control request to get it away from the mob and legitimize it. Mm-hmm. And they did. That was the rise of one of the larger, I guess you could say, gambling or casino conglomerates here in the United States. So now after this, when Lansky's forced to rely on just his Las Vegas income, I'm not going to say he turned legit, but he almost, I guess you could almost say semi-retired in a way. He started living a very, very low-profile life. And he was living in Florida, Miami. And he was just dressing like your average grandfather. And portraying himself as a harmless retiree. His associates, he would meet with his associates in malls and other crowded locations, constantly changing drivers, looking for new payphones and stuff like that every day. So he was still controlling things, but he was living a more low-key life.
For good reason.
Yes. Now, in 1970, he fled to Israel. He's fleeing to Israel to escape exactly what he had known he was at risk for way back in the day that we already talked about, when he started getting numbered Swiss accounts and decided to buy his own damn bank.
Oh.
Yeah, the feds were pursuing him for tax evasion. So he fled to Israel, which was a common haven at the time for Jewish people, because it's very, very friendly to Jewish people. However, it's still a strong ally of ours, and although Israel's law of return allows any Jew to settle in Israel, it does exclude those with criminal pasts. So 2 years after he fled to Israel, he was sent back. Israeli authorities deported him. They sent him back to the United States. And then the U.S. brought him up on charges. Unfortunately, their case, a good portion of their case, rested on a loan shark, Vet Vinny Vincent Teresa. And he was an informant with very, very, very little credibility. Lansky was actually acquitted in 1974. So you could actually look at Lansky is this incredibly famous mob figure, and he did things that is just absolutely amazing. I'm actually surprised nobody has done I know there's been movies and such on Meyer Lansky, but considering the rise of shows like Boardwalk Empire and The Sopranos, especially Boardwalk Empire because it's based off of a real gangster.
Well, he actually did have a part in Boardwalk Empire.
Well, yeah, he showed up in it, as did Al Capone and Luciano and all these. But I'm surprised there hasn't been a television show about Meyer Lansky.
There should be.
I mean, his life was far more fascinating even than Boardwalk Empire's. Nucky Johnson was based off Nucky Thompson, I believe, and he was just brilliant in the things he managed to pull off. It was just absolutely crazy. It was absolutely crazy. So Lansky eventually dies. Shocking. I mean, I thought he was going to live forever. So he eventually dies, and in 1983, he was old. He was 83 or 80. I'm sorry. 1983. He was 80 because he died before his 81st birthday. And supposedly, now he died of lung cancer, leaving behind his wife and 3 children. Now, on paper, he was worth next to nothing. Now, the FBI believed that he left behind over $600 million in hidden bank accounts, but no money has ever been found. Now, his biographer described Lansky's financial situation as financially strained in the last 2 decades of his life. Now, that's where I get kind of like, are you kidding me? Because if you go 2 decades back, you're firmly entrenched in the time period that the FBI's records still show Lansky as having a strong financial interest just in the Flamingo alone, not counting all the other locations. So he still had a revenue stream. But his biographer says there was no evidence that sustains the notion of Lansky as the king of all evil, the brains, the secret mover, the inspirer, controller of American organized crime. Lansky's biographer, Robert Lacey, concludes from the evidence that he was able to get and interviews with surviving members of the family that Lansky's wealth and influence had actually been grossly exaggerated. And he tends to think of him more as an accountant for gangsters rather than a gangster himself. Now, I would have to strongly disagree with this. An accountant for gangsters does not have a seat at the commission.
No.
An accountant for gangsters doesn't have a vote in these conferences and these meetings. An accountant for gangsters wouldn't have Bugsy Siegel as his number 2.
Right.
So there's definitely, it doesn't quite make sense. Now, Lansky's second wife's granddaughter told one author that at his death in '83, Lansky left only $37,000 in cash. And when he was asked in his later years about what happened, what went wrong in Cuba, Lansky's exact words were, "I crapped out." So obviously craps was definitely a part of his gambling empire for sure. Now, he would tell people he lost every penny he had in Cuba. There's a really good chance, though, that he was saying this as a smoke show. He was blowing smoke up the FBI's delicate donut.
Rustic balloon now?
Exactly. Just to brown chewing gum. Just to make sure that the IRS would stay off of his back. According to one of Lansky's daughters, he transferred at least $15 million to his brother due to his problems with the IRS. And what's interesting is that on paper, Lansky almost died a pauper. But in the height of all this, even as he semi-retired and just meeting his people in malls and in busy places, he had a chauffeur. He's meeting these people that were all
Still influential.
way better off than Lansky visually. Every single one of them seemed to be so much better off. They all seemed to own hotels and restaurants and nightclubs and stocks and bonds and some of them even owned banks. Sam Cohen owned banks, and yet they all seem to be answering to this semi-retired broke pauper. It doesn't quite seem right.
And it was said that he didn't own property or things, he owned people.
And that seems much more likely. It's highly likely that Lansky was so brilliant in what he did that he was able to keep all of his money in other people's names and still able to control it all. Because, if you think about it from a gangster's perspective, if I've got $100 million and I split up this $100 million by giving each one of my subordinates $20 million, let's just say that I don't end up taking a dirt nap because now they got $20 million. But most gangsters control their people with money. So he was just that good. He was just that good that he was able to maintain his control in his empire and just build this up and support himself until the day of his death, while looking on paper like a pauper.
Yep, I buy it.
Now, the FBI certainly wasn't fooled, even though they couldn't pin anything on him. They definitely kept an eye on him everywhere he went until the day he died. And the FBI is still convinced that a huge chunk of his money is out there somewhere. And might actually just be lost now. Could be in some bank account somewhere, and a number bank account somewhere that the bank is just holding on to the money, waiting for someone to claim it.
Yeah.
And it's just going to sit there forever. It's just going to be ones and zeros. So I hope you guys find this interesting. Do you have any parting thoughts on Meyer Lansky?
I think, especially regarding the thought of him being broke, I just think that he was just infinitely smarter than everybody else. He wanted everyone to underestimate him and think that he wasn't capable of the things that he was. He convinced his biographer that he was a nobody, that he was an accountant. And I don't buy that for a hot second. I just think that, he was so intelligent and so far ahead of everybody else in terms of thinking moves ahead, steps ahead, that he probably found some sort of amusement in having people think less of him than he was.
And he was brilliant.
Absolutely.
Think about this too. You'll notice from everything that we've talked about Meyer Lansky, there's one thing that kind of stands out to me that we didn't talk about. How many times he didn't go to jail. Meyer Lansky never got arrested. He got arrested, but he was acquitted.
Not true. He, 1918, when he was still young, he was arrested, spent 30 days in jail, and had to pay a $2,500 fine.
So when he was 16?
1918, yeah.
So he was 16, so he spent 30 days in jail. Once he was an adult and started the gang with Bugsy Siegel, then eventually took over the Jewish mob, then eventually had ties to the Italian mob, almost combined the two organizations, helped create the commission, had seats on the commission, met with, it was at these Havana meetings, was at the Havana, what was it called, the Havana Convention.
I'm sure a lot of palms were greased.
Oh, absolutely.
That's all it is.
Absolutely. But all these mobsters that we hear about or read about that ended up in jail or dead were greasing a lot of palms also.
That's a golden rule, babe. Whoever has the gold makes the rules.
That's right. And yet, he still did what Al Capone couldn't do. He still did what the Teflon Don couldn't do. He was just
too arrogant.
But Lansky did what
he was smarter than they are.
All of them.
That's my opinion.
Were not able to do. He died of basically old age. I mean, lung cancer, sure, but when you're 80,
Yeah.
that's old age.
Yeah.
Or natural
crapped out.
causes in a way. Yeah. And, didn't spend a day of his adult life in jail. Except for, when he was, I'm sure when they arrested him and tried to bring him to
Waiting
trial,
for trial.
but he probably bailed out of that real freaking. Although if you're arrested and being charged with tax evasion, maybe you don't pay $1 million bail.
No.
Maybe you just sit there in jail. But yeah, I'm just a poor old boy. But that says a lot about Meyer Lansky. Is that, I mean, he would have been the epitome of success.
Absolutely.
For a mafia kingpin, even today.
Mm-hmm.
Even today, how many of them today don't last 5 years before they're dead or in jail?
Yep.
So, yeah, I hope you guys enjoy this, and don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons. And if you guys have anything you would like us to film regarding Vegas history, please shoot us an email. We're more than happy to film it for you guys.
And for the record, I am more than happy to do any mob-related videos or organized crime videos that you guys have any interest in. It's probably, you can ask Jace, it's probably one of my favorite areas of anything to research. So I'm more than happy to do whatever organized crime videos you guys want to see. So until the next time, bye.
Bye now.